spring outfits and opulent pageants and productions. The point is to attract people to the church with more, better, louder, flashier everything than the church next door, or at least superior to what we had last year. Parallel to that, 3 women in ancient Palestine got up before dawn, after harrowing days and presumably sleepless nights, and walked without male presence, without protective personnel, without a detailed plan, a guarantee, or a gun, to the tomb of a rebel who had been assassinated by the state. This rebel was a brown man who had spent 3 years openly demonstrating and speaking out about an alternate way of living, a kingdom not of this world, and definitely not subordinate to Rome. It would seem to us that these 3 women, whom we meet by name, Magdalene, Mary, and Salome, were ill-prepared for their early morning mission, except for the respects they were determined to pay to the deceased. Both the American Christian Church and the 3 Palestinian women tell Easter morning stories. But how can they be so different? How has one become based on public show, while the other is firmly grounded in private commitment? Let's look first at what led up to this biblical resurrection account, which will then shed light on how our perception of it has changed over millennia. Jesus carried out his assignment both privately and publicly. He privately mentored a group of followers to become those who would lead the movement forward. He also spoke very openly about what he termed the kingdom of God. Mostly he drew comparisons to the kingdoms that the local population or his listeners were familiar with. Empires with centralized power and deputized authoritarian rulers, both of which fomented fear and oppressed the marginalized. Jesus' private and public messages were identical and could be summed up with something like this. What you are experiencing in the world now is not God's vision for humanity. There is to be no distinction based on gender. There is to be no division into caste systems based on wealth or poverty. Those considered outcasts by the empire are included in the kingdom of God. All are loved equally and welcomed fiercely. This was enough to destabilize the proponents of organized religion and empire alike, and they were public about it. Jesus cultivated a private life that stands in stark contrast to the public space's dominant religion and dominion-seeking empire occupied. Jesus spent many nights alone on the hillside communing with Yahweh. His agony was private. His devotion led him to the final agonizing moment on the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper with his friends and before Judas's betrayal. He prayed, he wept, he wrestled as he stood there in front of this threatening event which he knew was coming. The only ones with him in the moment were a few of his closest friends, and all of them had fallen asleep. He truly was alone in this agony. But not for long. His private agony, his wrestling with the divine, were cut short by clamor and chaos. It was a betrayal under the cover of darkness, prompted by a love of money. A betrayal by one of his closest friends, one who had been with him earlier that evening as they sat around the table. This was a public and loud betrayal, followed by a pseudo-trial and a quick assassination. There was no due process, no carefully selected witnesses to testify, no jury, no attorney representation whatsoever. Even the equivalent of a Supreme Court did not even have a chance to weigh in. It was more like and abduction, followed by predetermined trial results and a quick, state-sanctioned execution. In brief, those are the broad strokes of what preceded resurrection. Jesus represented private and public integrity. The opponents displayed rash, loud, and public defamation, which led to a death sentence. What becomes very clear is that there can be no resurrection without death. It's impossible. And yet, over the century, the whole episode has been sanitized, summarized, and condensed to the point where Jesus' agony on the Mount of Olives, the mockery of his trial, and his brutal execution are given a mere nod so that we can move right into an Easter celebration. This is not how life works. Life is filled with agony, injustice, false accusation, betrayals, grief, death, physical death, the assassination of a character, the death of relationships, the death of a partner, a spouse, a friend, or a dream. When we look at nature, we observe this cycle of seasons, the germination or birth, maturing and death of plants and animals. All of this points to the fact that life and death are two sides of the same coin. Contrary to what we've been immersed in over decades, every season of life and death is beautiful. The beginning of life leads us through various time periods, seasons, and ultimately it culminates in death. Yes, I said culminates. It is not a sentence, nor does it demand our intense avoidance. It is also not the subject of morbidity. The life cycle absolutely includes death, just as it includes birth. It's when we do not understand this relationship that we feel betrayed by death. Magdalene, Mary, and Salome understood this. While the death of this vibrant 33-year-old visionary was premature and horrific in our estimation, those who lived with and loved him knew this to be a reality in this brutal empire to which they were forced to submit. They were unwilling to let go of the rituals and the ceremonies, however. They gathered those spices together to pay their respects, to place all over the body as they had always done. That was part of their world. What was not a part of their ceremonial planning was what to do with the obstacles of empire. And in this case, the removal of a very large stone covering the entrance of the tomb. It is only when they are already underway that they verbalize this dilemma amongst each other. But the unexpected, the miracle, had already taken place. They didn't know how, they didn't know who had had a hand in it, but the stone had been rolled away. It had all happened in private. No fanfare that they observed. The earthquake and the rocks trembling, which are mentioned in other gospel accounts, were unobserved, except for the guards who fell to the ground as if they were dead. Then suddenly these three women are faced with a white-robed being, which they had not expected. It seems that they were not shocked by the fact that the stone was rolled away as much as they were alarmed when this being, who was not Jesus, begins to speak with them. In this private moment, they're given an assignment. Go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you. We're then told that they were overcome with terror and dread. It could well be that this terror and dread came a result of their assignment, not as a result of this supernatural event with which they had been confronted. Women, you see, were not considered reliable carriers of any kind of information in their day, and yet there they were, They were commissioned by this white-robed, ostensibly heavenly being to carry the news to the other disciples, and they knew who they were. But no one could serve as the witnesses to what they had heard. Only they heard it. And according to our text, they say nothing about that to anyone because they were afraid. Again, other Gospels fill in the story to let us know that they did, in fact, go and tell their message to the other disciples, but this had been given to them in private, so they weren't believed. There was no one to corroborate the story. You know, hysterical women and all. Oh, the dilemma of private encounters with divine messages and callings. Soon enough, their message would be verified by the actual appearance of Jesus to all of them. But in that moment, they must have felt like this is a setup. As we hear this story, and as we come to this point, our pragmatic Western brains kick in with how we could advise the divine on how to maximize the impact of cosmic events, which messaging tools to employ to reach the greatest audiences, and the profile of the ones best suited to deliver strategic messages, especially considering this hardened population, i.e. the skeptics. The resurrection event would have scored abysmally on any Western assessment tool. This is why I imagine Easter celebrations have ballooned into the mammoth entertainment sensations that will take place in churches all across this nation today. Parallel to this, but not as noticeable, is how we have exchanged transformation for transaction. The resurrection reality is so multifaceted and can be understood in so many different life-changing and ever-recurring ways that we will never run out of resurrection potential in our lives. The most obvious, again, is nature. Every spring, especially in colder climates, it's clearly observable how new life buds, or hatches, or births, grows out of apparent death every year. In our own lives, we understand how one season gives way to the next, beginning immediately when a baby is born. Resurrection is with us constantly. Birth is with us constantly. And death is with us constantly. All of it is part of transformation. But we settle for, actually we demand, transaction instead of transformation. One is quick, clean, and efficient, and the other is messy and unpredictable and mystical. Historically, Christians have embraced transactional salvation instead of transformative power. Transactional salvation will simply require one right statement, one sinner's prayer, a one-and-done experience, a transaction. Jesus did it all, and all I need to do is say the right thing once. Give a cognitive approval to certain indisputable dogma, and everything changes in an instant. It is instant certainty which demands little. It absolves us from responsibility, but puts controlling power into the hands of the one or the entity that has facilitated the transaction. Mostly the church. And it is convenient that transactions can be monitored, marketed, and monetized. With the right system in place, it counts, it controls, and it demands conformity. And it can be celebrated under the bright lights with glowing faces and promising benefits. Transaction does not help us deal with death because it does not foster compassion. And of course, resurrection cannot happen without death, and true resurrection is only possible because of compassion. In a sense, we have sold our souls to the demonic notion that we can live faithfully, mature quickly, and benefit from the gifts of the Christ without reflecting anything resembling the Christ himself. It's a gimmick, and it is a death blow. The gospel of Christ is transformative. Anything less is mockery. Transformation is a journey, not a destination. Transformation includes many celebrations, including many Easter celebrations, much joy, great fulfillment, and a lot of interpersonal connection, but never for the sake of cameras, applause, positive reviews, or increased revenues. If we really want to pursue transformation, we can begin by making a list of Jesus' statements in the Gospels. That would set us on an enlightening path. Just one example. When he says, take up the cross, this is not a call to a hard life or even a death like he suffered, but it is a call to cultivate compassion. It is an invitation to embrace rather than shrink away from challenges. It is a deep conviction that resurrection follows crucifixion. Father Richard Rohr puts it this way, and I quote, Easter reveals that there are no dead ends. Ultimately, nothing is going to end in tragedy and crucifixion, end quote. In other words, there is always resurrection after every hurdle, every hardship, every humiliation, and every inhumanity. This is true even after death. Easter is not merely a bodily resurrection, to which the resurrection event has often been reduced, but it is a resurrection to no dead ends. So suddenly, take up your cross leads to watch for the sunrise. Another example. When Jesus' adversaries try to trap him using someone whom they consider a despicable sinner, he addresses that person, the accusers used as a human pawn, with the words, I do not condemn you. This is transformation. This is not transaction. This is an invitation, not a sentence. This is compassion, not compensation. Resurrection is transformative, never transactional. When I was a child, I loved Easter. In my memory, it was always connected with Easter colors, namely yellow and lavender, and newly sewn spring outfits, and lots of food, and lots of people. For me, Easter was and still is incomplete without Ukrainian Easter bread. And I remember huge family gatherings, at least as huge as I could imagine them at 5 or 10 years old. There's nothing wrong with any of that. We love it, we celebrate it, we enjoy ourselves. But I also recognize that I am a child of modernity just like you are, and transaction threatens to eclipse transformation. That has dawned on me quite gradually, but with earth-shaking revelation. It is said that in the Pacific Northwest, when a pine tree thunders to the ground in a quarter-mile radius shakes. Imagine that. This is what happened with the Easter earthquake. The rocks trembled, the earth shook, the lightning blinded. But it was not a public event. It was private. This kind of quantum leap defied transaction which demands measurable outcomes and monetary returns. No, this was a transformational phenomenon. Transformation is an embrace of all of life, from birth through infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and elderhood. It is like an aged wine when compared with a younger wine, both having enticing qualities. But the aging process refines and deepens the textures and the flavors. This is how transformation works. I invite you, wherever you are on life's journey, to embrace the transformational instead of the transactional. Easter experience is transformational. Take some time after the food and the people and the lively conversations to reflect on just how the resurrection can transform your private world. And I guarantee you, once it does, your public life will also be transformed. May God help us.